This morning, diving into an ancient civilization to learn more about discoveries helping our modern world. The Mayan civilization dates back as far as 1000 BC or earlier. Their territory covered about 120,000 square miles in Central America.
This morning, we're heading into the jungles of Belize, into a tomb that sat sealed for 1,700 years, to talk about a discovery that archaeologists are still trying to figure out how to explain in plain language. In the spring of 2025, in the dense green tangle of Caracol, once one of the largest cities in the entire Maya world, a husband and wife team of archaeologists reopened a burial chamber they had first explored more than 30 years earlier. They dug a little deeper than they had before, and beneath that older chamber, they hit something else entirely, a second, older tomb that nobody had touched in 17 centuries. What they found down there wasn't just bones. It was a king. Caracol itself is almost impossible to picture today, unless you've stood in it. At its height, during the 6th and 7th centuries, the city sprawled across roughly 68 square miles of what is now northern Belize, and it may have been home to more than 100,000 people. Its central pyramid, a step structure called Cana, still rises higher than almost any building in the country, even now, even buried in vines and root systems. For decades, the archaeologists who study this place, Arlen and Diane Chase of the University of Houston, have used laser mapping technology to strip away the jungle canopy in digital form, revealing causeways, reservoirs, terraces, and neighborhoods that stretch far beyond what anyone assumed a Maya ceremonial center should look like. Caracol wasn't a temple complex with some huts around it. It was a metropolis with plumbing. But for all 4 decades of digging, one thing had eluded them: an identifiable royal tomb. Elite burials, yes, fine ones, but never a king they could put a name to. That changed in the Northeast Acropolis, a compound of shrines and residences the Chases had been quietly studying for years. Beneath a second stone floor, sealed under layers of later construction, they found a chamber with walls still stained red from cinnabar, the mineral pigment Maya elites used to mark the highest possible status. And inside, laid out with obvious care, were the remains of a man who had lived a long life and been sent into the afterlife with everything his people believed a founding king deserved. Let's start with what was around him, because the objects tell as much of the story as the bones do. Resting near where his face would have been was a mosaic death mask, built from dozens of individual pieces of jadeite fitted together by hand. By the time it was found, centuries of pressure and shifting earth had cracked and scattered the mosaic, and the team now faces the slow, nerve-wracking process of piecing it back together fragment by fragment. Jade mattered enormously to the Maya, not as jewelry in our sense, but as a material saturated with meaning. Its green tied it to maize, to water, to breath and renewal. To wear jade into death was to declare that your vitality didn't end with your body. The nearest known source of this particular jadeite is the Motagua Valley, across the border in what's now Guatemala, meaning this stone had already traveled a considerable distance before it ever reached Caracol. Surrounding the body, archaeologists counted 11 painted ceramic vessels. The scenes on them weren't random decoration. One showed a Maya ruler receiving offerings, spear in hand, from figures that appear to be deities or supplicants. The imagery on Maya pottery like this typically does double duty. It's art, but it's also a kind of political statement, a visual argument for who holds power and why. Painted pottery from a royal tomb isn't just beautiful. It's propaganda that outlived its audience by 1,700 years. Then there were the jade ear flares, 3 sets of them, along with carved bone tubes and a scattering of spondylus shells, the kind with that unmistakable orange-pink shimmer that Maya elites associated with blood, sunrise, and sacred authority. Spondylus doesn't come from anywhere near Belize. Its nearest source is the Pacific coast, hundreds of miles away, across mountain ranges and other people's territory. Getting a shell like that to Caracol in the 4th century meant it had passed through multiple hands, multiple economies, multiple political relationships, long before it ever touched this king's tomb. And this is where the story stops being simple. Mixed in among the local and regional materials, the excavation team found objects that don't belong to any Maya tradition at all. Fragments of green obsidian, chemically traceable to a source near Pachuca, in central Mexico. A source that, at this period in history, was tightly controlled by the enormous city of Teotihuacan, more than 1,000 miles to the northwest. Alongside it, evidence connecting the burial to Teotihuacan-style ritual practice and weaponry, the kind of material culture archaeologists associate specifically with that distant civilization's elite class, not with the Maya lowlands. To put the distance in perspective, this is the 4th century. No wheeled transport. No pack animals suited to hauling goods that far. No road network in any sense we'd recognize. And yet, somehow, objects tied to the ritual life of the largest city in the ancient Americas turned up sealed inside the founding tomb of a Maya dynasty 1,000 miles away. For a long time, the standard chronology of Maya history treated the year 378 CE as the turning point when Teotihuacan's influence entered the Maya world, a moment recorded in inscriptions at the city of Tikal, describing what looks like an outside intervention in local politics. Everything before that date was assumed to be purely locally Maya. Everything after was read through the lens of that outside contact. But radiocarbon dating on charcoal recovered from this tomb's fill, processed at a well-regarded accelerator mass spectrometry lab, placed the burial at somewhere between roughly 330 and 350 CE, decades before that supposed turning point. From the Pacific and ritual objects from a civilization 1,000 miles away, and did all of that at least a generation before historians thought that kind of connection ceramic specialists studying the vessel styles independently arrived at a compatible window. 2 separate methods, agreeing with each other, both landing squarely in the earliest generation of Caracol's royal line. Later inscriptions at the city name that founding ruler, Tecabchoc, a name that roughly translates to something like tree branch rain god. According to those later royal records, he took a throne in 331 CE and started a dynasty that would go on to rule Caracol for close to 500 years. Which means if this is his tomb, and the placement, the dating, and the artifacts all point strongly in that direction, then the connection between the Maya lowlands and distant Teotihuacan wasn't something that arrived later, imposed from outside. It was there at the very beginning. It was baked into the founding of the dynasty itself. What the skeleton itself can tell us at this stage is more limited than you might expect. And this is worth being honest about, because it's the part where a lot of retellings of this story start to get ahead of the evidence. The remains are those of an older man, by the analysis so far, someone who had lived long enough to lose all of his teeth, with bone regrowth over the jaw suggesting he survived that loss by years rather than dying soon after. That alone is notable. A long life, in an era and a role where many rulers didn't get one. Estimates based on the skeleton put his height at around 5'7", tall for the place and period. But here's the honest part, the part that separates careful archaeology from the version of this story that spreads fastest online. At the time this tomb was announced, the ancient DNA work and the isotope testing on his remains, the test that could actually speak to where he was born, where he spent his childhood, and what his deeper ancestry looked like, had only just begun. The researchers themselves have been direct about this. Diane Chase, one of the 2 lead archaeologists, has said plainly that these tests are the next step, not a finished result. The team wants that data specifically to help confirm whether this man really is Tecabchoc, and to understand whether he grew up locally or somewhere else entirely. That's a very different situation from a headline that says DNA has already revealed his hidden origins. It hasn't, not yet, not publicly, not in any peer-reviewed sense. What we actually have is a tomb, a set of artifacts pointing in 2 directions at once, a date that rewrites part of the political timeline, and a question that ancient DNA analysis is uniquely positioned to answer, once it's done properly. And that's arguably the more interesting place to sit with this story than a premature answer would be. Because the question itself is enormous. If this man's genetics eventually show a background rooted entirely in the Maya lowlands, then everything found around him, the obsidian, the Teotihuacan-linked ritual materials, starts to look like something closer to political theater. A local ruler dressing his authority in the prestige of a distant powerful civilization, the way European monarchs, centuries later borrowed the visual language of ancient Rome to make their own crowns look older and more legitimate than they were. borrowed symbolism deployed on purpose by someone who understood exactly what kind of message it sent. If, on the other hand, his ancestry traces back towards central Mexico, the story shifts into something else, a foreign-born figure who became, or was made into, the founder of a Maya royal line. Not a costume, a person. And there's a third possibility that the archaeologists working on this site have been careful to leave room for, which may end up being the most historically accurate one. That the categories themselves, Maya, Teotihuacano, local, foreign, were never as separate in practice as they've been treated on paper. Mesoamerica, in this period, wasn't a set of sealed, isolated civilizations bumping into each other occasionally at their borders. It was a web of trade routes, marriages, diplomatic exchanges, and long-distance movement that had likely been running for generations before this king was ever born. A person's ancestry could easily reflect that whole web, rather than sitting cleanly on one side of a line historians would only draw much later. That's the real reason this discovery has caught the attention of researchers well beyond the small world of Maya archaeology. It's not that it hands us a tidy revelation. It's that it takes a question scholars have been arguing about for nearly a century. When exactly did Teotihuacan's influence reach the Maya lowlands, and what did that influence actually look like on the ground? And pushes it back by at least a generation, right into the founding moment of one of the most powerful cities in the region. The old assumption that 378 CE was the beginning of that relationship doesn't hold up against a tomb sealed decades earlier that's already full of central Mexican material. Whatever this relationship was, it was older, and it went deeper than the textbooks have said. The Chases have described this as one of the most important finds of their careers, and given that they've spent more than 40 years working this one site, that's not a small claim. They presented early findings at a Santa Fe Institute conference focused specifically on Maya, Teotihuacan interaction in the summer of 2025, and the fuller analysis. The DNA, the isotopes, the reconstructed jade mask is still in progress, moving through the slow, careful process that real archaeological science requires before anyone publishes a conclusion.